The scorching Arizona sun beat down on Nogales like a blacksmith's hammer, unforgiving and relentless, as Jackson Pierce adjusted his worn leather hat and squinted at the dusty horizon. It was 1878, and the small border town was just beginning to flourish with the recent silver strikes and the promise of the Southern Pacific Railroad pushing ever westward. But prosperity wasn't what Jackson sought. What he wanted couldn't be bought with silver dollars or promised by iron rails. "Another," Jackson said, sliding his empty whiskey glass across the scratched oak bar of the Copper Spur Saloon. His voice, like gravel under wagon wheels, matched his weathered appearance, a man of 32 who looked closer to 40. "You're hitting it pretty hard today, Pierce," remarked Otto, the German bartender who'd come west after the war. "Something eating at you." Jackson's ice-blue eyes flickered up briefly, then returned to studying the amber liquid that now filled his glass. "Just pour, Otto. I ain't paying you for conversation." The bartender shrugged and moved down the bar to serve the other patrons, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts and his whiskey. 3 years he'd been in Nogales, working cattle for the Double Cross Ranch, saving his money and keeping to himself. 3 years of rising before dawn and collapsing into his bunk well after dusk. 3 years of dusty cattle drives and breaking wild horses. 3 years of emptiness. The batwing doors of the saloon swung open, bringing with them a blinding slice of sunlight and the silhouette of a woman. Not one of the painted ladies who worked upstairs, but someone different, someone new. She stepped fully into the saloon, and the usual clamor of conversation dimmed as heads turned. She wore a simple blue traveling dress, dusty from the road but clearly of fine quality. Her chestnut hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, and she carried herself with a dignity that seemed out of place in the rough establishment. Jackson, like the others, couldn't help but stare as she approached the bar, positioning herself 2 stools away from him. "Excuse me," she addressed Otto in a voice that carried the refined tones of the East. "I'm looking for Sheriff Dawson. I was told he might be here." Otto's eyebrows rose. "Sheriff's making his rounds. Should be back in an hour or so. Can I help you with something else, miss?" "I'll wait for him, thank you." She hesitated. "Perhaps some water if you have it." A few snickers rippled through the saloon at her request. Water was for horses and washing, not for drinking in a place like this. "Don't mind them," Otto said, producing a relatively clean glass and filling it from a pitcher. "New in town?" "Yes, I arrived on the stage this morning." Jackson kept his eyes on his whiskey but found his ears straining to catch every word she spoke. There was something about her voice, a warmth that contrasted with the harshness of Nogales. "Name's Otto," the bartender continued. "And you are?" "Rebecca James," she replied. "I've come from Boston to—" Her words were cut short as the doors banged open again, this time admitting 3 men whose spurs jangled against the wooden floor like warning bells. "Well, look what we have here, boys," said the tallest of the 3, a lanky man with a pockmarked face and a cruel smile. "Fresh meat." Jackson recognized them immediately. Wade Sutton and his 2 cronies who worked for the rival Crescent Moon Ranch. Troublemakers, the lot of them. Rebecca stiffened but kept her gaze forward, seemingly determined to ignore the unwanted attention. "I'm talking to you, pretty lady," Wade said, closing the distance to stand uncomfortably close behind her. "What brings a fine thing like you to our little slice of heaven?" "My business is my own, sir," Rebecca replied coolly. "Now, if you'll excuse me." Wade's hand shot out, gripping her arm as she attempted to move away. "Don't be in such a hurry, we're just being friendly." Jackson watched the scene unfold, his jaw clenching. It wasn't his business. He didn't know this woman, and getting involved would only bring trouble. Yet something inside him, something he thought long dead, began to stir. "The lady asked to be excused," Jackson said, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. The saloon fell silent as Wade turned his attention to Jackson, his face darkening. "This ain't your concern, Pierce. Go back to your bottle." Jackson set down his glass with deliberate care and stood. He was not a particularly large man, but there was a coiled tension to his movements that suggested danger. "I'm making it my concern." Rebecca's eyes met his for the first time, deep brown and filled with both fear and gratitude. "You willing to bleed for a woman you don't even know?" Wade sneered, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. Are you? Jackson countered, his own hand steady at his side. The tension in the room was palpable as the two men stared each other down. Finally, Wade's eyes flickered, and he released Rebecca's arm with a dismissive gesture. She ain't worth the trouble, he spat, backing away. Come on, boys. The three men retreated, making a show of laughing it off, but the hatred in Wade's eyes as he glanced back promised that the matter wasn't settled. Once they were gone, the normal buzz of conversation slowly resumed. Rebecca rubbed her arm where Wade had gripped it and turned to Jackson. Thank you, Mr. Pierce. Jackson Pierce. He sat back down, uncomfortable with her gratitude. No need for thanks. Sutton's a dog who needs to be kept on a leash. She slid onto the stool beside him. Nevertheless, I appreciate your intervention. I'm Rebecca James. Jackson nodded, not offering his hand or further conversation. He hoped she'd take the hint and leave him be, but instead she stayed, studying him with those penetrating brown eyes. You don't seem like the typical cowhand, Mr. Pierce. He took another sip of whiskey. And what would you know about typical cowhands, Miss James from Boston? A smile touched her lips, transforming her face in a way that made Jackson's chest tighten unexpectedly. More than you might think. My father was a rancher in Kansas before we moved east. I grew up around men like you, or at least, men who do what you do. Men like me, Jackson echoed, a bitter edge to his voice. You don't know anything about men like me? Perhaps not, she conceded, undeterred by his gruffness. But I'd like to. Before Jackson could respond, the batwing doors swung open again, this time admitting Sheriff Dawson, a barrel-chested man with a silver-streaked beard and keen eyes that missed little. Miss James, he called out, spotting her at the bar. Got your telegram, been expecting you. Rebecca stood, gathering her small handbag. Sheriff, thank you for meeting me. I hope we can discuss the matter I mentioned. Of course, Dawson said, tipping his hat to her. We can talk in my office. She turned back to Jackson, who was already reaching for his glass again. It was a pleasure meeting you, Mr. Pierce. I hope our paths cross again. Jackson didn't respond, didn't even look up as she walked away. But he found himself listening to the sound of her footsteps until they faded, and when he finally raised his head, he caught himself staring at the door long after she'd gone. That's trouble, my friend, Otto said, refilling Jackson's glass without being asked. What is? That look in your eyes when you watched her leave, Jackson scoffed. You're seeing things, Otto. Maybe, the bartender shrugged. Or maybe I'm seeing something you don't want to admit is there. Jackson downed his whiskey in one swallow and stood, tossing a few coins on the bar. I've got work to do. As he stepped out into the harsh sunlight, he couldn't shake the memory of Rebecca James's smile or the way her eyes had looked when they met his, and that bothered him more than he cared to admit. The next day found Jackson in the livery stable, examining the hoof of a chestnut mare that had come up lame during yesterday's ride. The blacksmith, Illy, had gone to get his tools, leaving Jackson alone with the horses and his thoughts. Mr. Pierce. The soft voice startled him, and he straightened to find Rebecca James standing in the stable entrance, the sunlight behind her creating a halo effect around her figure. Miss James, he acknowledged, wiping his hands on a rag. Sheriff, help you with whatever you came to town for. She stepped fully into the stable, the smell of hay and horses enveloping them both. In a manner of speaking, he's directed me to several people who might assist me further. Jackson waited for her to elaborate, but when she didn't, he turned back to the mare. Well, good luck with your business then. Actually, Rebecca continued, moving closer, I was hoping you might be one of those people. Jackson looked at her skeptically. Me, what could I possibly help you with? I'm looking for someone, she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. A man named Ethan Blackwell. The name hit Jackson like a physical blow, though he kept his face carefully neutral. Can't say I know him. Sheriff Dawson seems to think you might. He said Blackwell worked at the Double Cross for a while, same as you. Jackson ran a hand over the mare's neck, buying himself time to think. Ethan Blackwell, a name he'd worked hard to forget. That was before my time, he lied. Why are you looking for him? Rebecca hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. It's a personal matter. Most things worth looking for are, Jackson replied, but Nogales is a long way from Boston for a personal matter. Yes, well, some matters justify the distance. Her eyes held his, unwavering. Mr. Blackwell owes my family an explanation at the very least. Jackson's curiosity was piqued despite himself. An explanation for what? For abandoning his wife and daughter 5 years ago, she said, a flash of anger breaking through her composed exterior. For disappearing without a trace and leaving them to fend for themselves. Understanding dawned on Jackson, along with a sinking feeling in his gut. You're his daughter, Rebecca nodded, her chin lifting slightly. I am, and I intend to find him. Jackson turned away, focusing on the horse again. Well, I can't help you, like I said, never met the man. Sheriff Dawson said you two rode together for a while, that you were friends. Sheriff's mistaken, Jackson said flatly. Look, Miss James, Nogales is full of drifters. Men come and go. Your father probably moved on years ago. Then I'll find where he moved on to, she replied, determination hardening her voice. I'm not leaving until I have answers. Jackson straightened and faced her, irritation flaring. What answers are you expecting? Men like your father, they leave because that's what they do. They don't explain, they don't apologize, they just go. Whatever story you're hoping to hear probably doesn't exist. His harsh words seemed to strike a nerve. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment he thought she might cry. Instead, she squared her shoulders. You speak as if from experience, Mr. Pierce. Were you abandoned too, or are you the one who did the abandoning? The question was like a knife between his ribs, precise and painful. Jackson's jaw tightened. You don't know anything about me. No, she agreed quietly, but I'd like to. Because I think you know more about Ethan Blackwell than you're willing to admit. Before Jackson could respond, Ellie returned with his tools, breaking the tension between them. Sorry that took so long, Jackson. Oh, hello, miss, the blacksmith greeted, tipping his hat to Rebecca. I should go, Rebecca said, backing toward the stable entrance. But this isn't finished, Mr. Pierce. I'll be staying at Mrs. Holbrook's boarding house if you find yourself remembering anything about my father. Jackson watched her leave, a mixture of emotions churning inside him. Damn Ethan Blackwell and damn Sheriff Dawson for sending the man's daughter his way. Pretty lady, Ellie commented, kneeling to examine the mare's hoof. What'd she want with you? Nothing worth giving, Jackson muttered, grabbing his hat from a nearby post. I'm heading back to the ranch. You good here? Ellie nodded, already absorbed in his work, and Jackson strode out of the stable, his mind racing. Rebecca James was trouble, just as Otto had predicted, but not for the reasons the bartender had suggested. Her search for her father threatened to unearth secrets. Jackson had spent years burying secrets that could destroy what little peace he'd managed to find in Nogales. The ride back to the Double Cross was long and hot, giving Jackson too much time to think about Rebecca and her quest. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the valley. He unsaddled his horse and was heading toward the bunkhouse when a voice called out to him, Pierce, got a minute? Jackson turned to see Samuel Cross, the owner of the ranch, standing on the porch of the main house. At 60, Sam was still as tough as rawhide, with a weathered face that told the story of decades under the southwestern sun. Yes, sir, Jackson responded, changing direction to join his boss on the porch. Heard you had a run-in with Wade Sutton in town yesterday, Sam said without preamble. News traveled fast in Nogales. Nothing serious, just Sutton being Sutton. Sam studied him for a moment. Also heard it involved a young lady from back east, asking questions about Ethan Blackwell. Jackson's expression remained carefully neutral. People talk too much. That they do, Sam agreed. But sometimes what they say matters. This young lady, she's Blackwell's daughter, so she says. Sam sighed heavily, lowering himself into a rocking chair and gesturing for Jackson to take the one beside him. You know, when I hired you 3 years ago, I didn't ask questions about your past. Figured a man deserves the chance to start fresh. Jackson remained standing, his body tense. I appreciate that. But this girl's showing up, asking about Blackwell, that complicates things, doesn't it? Only if I let it, Jackson replied. Sam's weathered hand reached out, gripping Jackson's arm with surprising strength. Son, I've seen that look before, on my own face after the war. You're carrying something heavy. Maybe it's time to put it down. Jackson pulled away gently. With all due respect, Mr. Cross, my burdens are mine to bear. Fair enough, Sam conceded. But remember, these secrets have a way of surfacing no matter how deep you bury them. And when they do, it's better to be the one doing the digging than the one getting buried. With that cryptic advice, Sam waved him off, and Jackson headed to the bunkhouse, more troubled than before. He couldn't sleep that night, his mind filled with memories he'd fought hard to forget, and the image of Rebecca James's determined face. 3 days passed before Jackson returned to town, having successfully avoided further conversations about Rebecca or Ethan Blackwell. But as he rode into Nogales to pick up supplies for the ranch, he knew his luck couldn't last. Sure enough, as he tied his horse outside the general store, he spotted Rebecca emerging from the telegraph office across the street. She saw him too, her eyes widening momentarily before her expression set into one of determination. She crossed the dusty street directly toward him. "Mr. Pierce," she greeted him, the sunlight highlighting the reddish undertones in her chestnut hair. "I was beginning to think you were avoiding me. Just been busy at the ranch," he replied, tipping his hat to her. "Any luck with your search?" "Some," she said, surprising him. "I've spoken with several people who knew my father. They've painted quite an interesting picture of the man." Jackson's stomach tightened. "Is that right?" "Yes, a charming drifter who never stayed in one place too long. Good with cards, better with horses. Quick to make friends, quicker to disappear when things got complicated." Her eyes bore into his. "Sound familiar?" "Sounds like half the men in the territory," Jackson deflected. "Perhaps, but most interesting was what Mr. Hobbs at the bank told me." She paused, watching his reaction. "He said Ethan Blackwell left town with another man after a disagreement with some gamblers, a man named Jackson Pierce." Jackson's jaw clenched. Damn Hobbs and his perfect memory. "Hobbs is mistaken." "Is he?" "Because Sheriff Dawson confirmed the same story, said you and my father rode out of Nogales together 5 years ago and that only you came back 3 years later." Rebecca's voice was steady, but he could hear the hurt and confusion beneath her controlled exterior. "Why lie to me, Mr. Pierce? What are you hiding?" Jackson glanced around, aware that their conversation was drawing curious looks from passersby. "This isn't the place for this discussion." "Then where is? Because I've been in Nogales for days now, asking questions, and you're the only one who seems unwilling to talk about my father." He sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "Fine, meet me at the edge of town by the old oak tree past the cemetery. Sunset." "I'll tell you what I know." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you, I'll be there." As she walked away, Jackson felt a weight settling on his shoulders. Tonight, he would have to confront the past he'd been running from for years, and he wasn't sure either of them was ready for the truth. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon when Jackson arrived at the old oak. Its massive branches spread wide, offering shade in the day and now framing the spectacular colors of the Arizona sunset. Rebecca was already there, seated on a fallen log, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She stood as he approached, her face partially shadowed in the fading light. "You came," said I would, he replied, dismounting and tying his horse to a low branch. He removed his hat, holding it awkwardly in his hands. "Before I say anything, I need to know, why is finding your father so important? It's been 5 years. Why now?" Rebecca's eyes dropped to the ground. "My mother died 6 months ago, consumption. Before she passed, she made me promise to find him to give him something." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. Her last letter to him. She wrote one every year on their anniversary, though she never sent them, never knew where to send them. Jackson's chest tightened. "I'm sorry about your mother." "Thank you," Rebecca said softly. "But it's more than just the letter. I need to understand why he left. My whole life I've wondered what we did wrong, what I did wrong, to make him leave without even saying goodbye." Her vulnerability struck him harder than he expected. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly. "Some men just aren't built for family life. It's not about the people they leave behind, it's about something broken inside themselves." "You sound like you speak from experience again, Mr. Pierce." He didn't deny it this time. Instead, he moved to sit on the fallen log, gesturing for her to join him. As she did, he stared out at the darkening landscape, gathering his courage. "I knew your father," he finally admitted. "We rode together for about a year." He never mentioned having a family back east, but then again, we didn't talk much about our pasts. Rebecca sat very still beside him, absorbing his words. What was he like? Jackson thought carefully before answering. Charming, like you said, good with horses. Had a way of making people trust him, but restless, always looking over his shoulder like something was chasing him. Was something chasing him? His own demons, maybe, and eventually some very real enemies. Ethan had a talent for cards and for cheating at them when necessary. Rebecca's breath caught. He was a cheat, among other things, Jackson acknowledged. He wasn't a bad man, not really, just flawed like most of us out here. What happened 5 years ago? She pressed. Why did you both leave Nogales? Jackson picked up a twig, breaking it methodically into smaller pieces as he spoke. Ethan got caught dealing from the bottom of the deck during a high-stakes game with some very dangerous men. Things got ugly. I stepped in, helped him get away. We rode hard for 2 days, heading north toward Colorado. He paused, the memories he'd suppressed for years now rising to the surface. On the 3rd day, we were ambushed near a place called Eagle Canyon. The men from the card game had followed us, brought friends. There was a shootout. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth. Did they? Your father was hit, Jackson said quietly, twice in the chest. There was nothing I could do for him. He died there in that canyon. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant call of a nighthawk. Rebecca sat motionless, tears streaming silently down her face in the gathering darkness. I buried him there, Jackson continued, his voice rough. Marked the grave with a pile of stones. I took his horse, his gun, what little money he had, and I kept riding. Ended up in California for a while before making my way back here. Why come back to Nogales? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jackson shook his head. I don't know, maybe because it was the last place where things made sense, or maybe because I was tired of running. Rebecca wiped her tears with the back of her hand. All this time, I imagined him alive somewhere, starting a new life, forgetting about us. I never considered that he might be. Her voice broke. Without thinking, Jackson reached out, his hand covering hers. I'm sorry, Rebecca. For your loss and for lying to you. She turned her hand to grip his tightly. Thank you for telling me the truth now. It's not what I hoped for, but at least now I know. They sat in silence as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear overhead. Jackson was acutely aware of her hand in his, warm and surprisingly strong. Did he? Rebecca began, then stopped, gathering herself. Did he ever speak of us, of me? Jackson hesitated. The truth was that Ethan had mentioned his family exactly once, during a drunken confession around a campfire. He'd spoken of the wife and daughter he'd abandoned, not with regret, but with a kind of detached acknowledgement, as if they were characters in a story that had nothing to do with him. He told me he had a daughter who loved horses as much as he did, Jackson said instead, offering her the kindness of a half-truth. Said you were smart, like your mother. Fresh tears welled in Rebecca's eyes. He remembered that about me. He did, Jackson nodded, feeling a twinge of guilt for the fabrication but unwilling to add to her pain. She sat straighter, squaring her shoulders. I should go back to Boston now. There's nothing left for me here. What will you do there? Continue teaching at the girls' school, I suppose. It's a good position, and I'm good at it. She sounded resigned rather than enthusiastic. You don't sound like someone eager to return home. Rebecca sighed. Boston never felt like home, not really. My mother moved us there after father left to be near her sister. But I always missed the openness of the West, the freedom of it. Jackson studied her profile in the moonlight, seeing something he recognized, a longing for a place that felt right, a sense of belonging that remained elusive. You could stay, he found himself saying. Nogales could use a good teacher. She looked at him in surprise. Stay here, but I know no one, have no connections, you know me, Jackson interrupted, surprising himself as much as her. And Sam Cross mentioned just yesterday that his foreman's wife is looking for someone to teach their children, maybe start a proper school for the ranch families in the area. You're suggesting I abandon my position in Boston to teach children on a cattle ranch in Arizona? Rebecca asked, but there was a hint of intrigue in her voice. Why not? You said yourself you miss the West, and sometimes the best way to find peace with the past is to build a new future. Their eyes met in the darkness, and something passed between them, an understanding, a possibility. "I'll consider it," she said finally, "but I need time to think, to process everything you've told me." Jackson nodded, releasing her hand and standing. "Fair enough. The stage east doesn't leave for another 3 days. That should give you time to decide." He helped her onto his horse and walked beside them back to town, their conversation drifting to lighter topics: the beauty of the desert night, the differences between Boston and Nogales, the characters who populated the small border town. By the time they reached Mrs. Holbrook's boarding house, Jackson found himself reluctant for the evening to end. "Thank you again, Mr. Pierce," Rebecca said as he helped her down from his horse. "For the truth and for the suggestion about staying, I truly will consider it." "Jackson," he corrected. "If you're considering making Nogales your home, you might as well call me by my name." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes despite the emotional revelations of the evening. "Jackson, then, good night." He watched her enter the boarding house before mounting his horse and heading back to the Double Cross, his mind and heart more unsettled than they had been in years. The next morning, Jackson threw himself into his work, trying not to think about Rebecca and the decision she was making. He was mending a section of fence in the north pasture when he heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, he was surprised to see Rebecca herself riding toward him on a borrowed mare, her skirts arranged modestly for riding astride. "Miss James," he greeted her, setting down his tools. "Didn't expect to see you out this way. I spoke with Mr. Cross this morning," she said without preamble, "about the teaching position. And," Jackson tried to keep his tone neutral, "and I've decided to stay, at least for a while." She dismounted gracefully, approaching him. "But there's something I need to know first." "What's that? Why did you lie to me initially about knowing my father, and why tell me the truth now?" Jackson removed his gloves, buying time as he considered how to answer. "At first, I didn't want to dredge up the past. Your father died because I wasn't fast enough, smart enough to protect him. That's not an easy thing to admit. And later, what changed?" He met her gaze directly. "You did. Your determination, your need for answers. And maybe I realized I've been carrying this secret long enough." Rebecca studied him, her expression thoughtful. "I appreciate your honesty, and I'd like to see my father's grave someday if you'd be willing to take me there. It's a hard journey, but yes, when you're ready." She nodded, then handed him a folded paper. "Mr. Cross asked me to give you this. He says it's important." Jackson opened the note, his brow furrowing as he read. "Looks like Wade Sutton and his boys have been rustling double-cross cattle. Sam wants all hands back at the main house to plan a response." "Is that dangerous?" Rebecca asked, concern evident in her voice. "Could be," Jackson admitted. "Sutton's not one to back down from a fight." She bit her lip, then squared her shoulders. "I should head back to town, let you handle this." As she turned to remount her horse, Jackson found himself reaching for her arm. "Rebecca, wait." She turned back, her eyes questioning. "Be careful in town. Sutton has friends there. If he gets wind that the Double Cross is onto him." "I'll be fine," she assured him. "I may be from Boston, but I'm not helpless." Jackson smiled despite his concern. "No, you certainly aren't." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary before she mounted and rode back toward town. Jackson watched her go, a strange mixture of worry and something else, something warmer, stirring in his chest. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of activity as the double-cross hands prepared to confront the rustlers. By nightfall, they had their plan. They would catch Sutton and his men in the act, bringing the sheriff along to make arrests rather than taking justice into their own hands. But as Jackson rode into position that night, taking cover near the south pasture where Sutton's gang was expected to strike, he couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. Something felt wrong, off-kilter, like the sudden silence before a summer storm. His instincts proved correct when one of the younger ranch hands came galloping toward their position, his horse lathered and his face pale in the moonlight. "Pierce," the young man gasped. "Sutton's not coming for the cattle, he's headed to town. Someone told him you know about the rustling, and he's aiming to silence you permanent." Like Jackson's blood ran cold. "How many men with him?" 4, maybe 5, cursing under his breath. Jackson wheeled his horse around. "Tell Sam what's happening, I'm heading to town." "You can't take on 5 men alone. I'm not planning on fighting them, Jackson called back, already galloping away. Just need to warn the sheriff. But as he rode hard toward Nogales, his mind filled with another concern, Rebecca. If Sutton knew about him, he might also know about her connection to him. The thought of her being caught in Sutton's vengeance sent a spike of fear through Jackson unlike anything he'd felt in years. The lights of Nogales appeared in the distance, and Jackson pushed his horse harder, praying he wasn't too late. The town was unnaturally quiet as Jackson rode in, the usual evening activities at the saloon and other establishments subdued. He headed straight for the sheriff's office, only to find it dark and empty. Cursing again, he turned toward Mrs. Holbrook's boarding house, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached, he saw the door standing open, a sliver of light spilling onto the porch. Drawing his pistol, Jackson dismounted and moved cautiously toward the entrance. "Mrs. Holbrook," he called out. "Rebecca," a muffled sound from inside drew him forward. Stepping through the doorway, he found Mrs. Holbrook sitting in a chair, her hands bound and a gag in her mouth. Her eyes widened at the sight of him, and she made urgent noises behind her gag. Jackson quickly moved to free her. "Where's Miss James?" he demanded as soon as the gag was removed. "They took her," Mrs. Holbrook sobbed. "That awful Sutton man and his friends. Said they were going to use her as bait to draw you out." "How long ago?" "Not 10 minutes. They mentioned the old silver mine." Jackson was already moving before she finished her sentence, remounting his horse and spurring him toward the abandoned mine on the outskirts of town. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Sutton was a cruel man under normal circumstances. With the threat of arrest for cattle rustling hanging over him, he would be desperate and even more dangerous. The old silver mine loomed dark against the night sky, its wooden structures deteriorating after years of abandonment. A faint light flickered from inside the main entrance, and Jackson dismounted a distance away, approaching on foot with his gun drawn. He could hear voices now, Sutton's distinctive drawl and the murmurs of his men. Then, Rebecca's voice, clear and defiant despite the fear that must be coursing through her. "Mr. Sutton, whatever quarrel you have with Mr. Pierce doesn't involve me." "That's where you're wrong, sweetheart," Sutton replied. "Pierce seems mighty taken with you. And men like him, men who pretend they don't care about nothing or nobody, they're the ones who fall hardest when they finally do care." Jackson's jaw clenched at Sutton's words, but more concerning was what they implied that Sutton intended to hurt Rebecca to get to him. Moving silently, Jackson circled around to a side entrance he remembered from years before, when the mine was still operational. The passage was narrow and partially collapsed, but it would allow him to come up behind Sutton and his men rather than walking straight into their trap. The going was slow in the darkness, and twice he nearly gave himself away when loose stones shifted under his feet. But finally, he reached a position where he could see into the main chamber of the mine. Rebecca was seated on a crate, her hands bound in front of her but her posture straight and dignified. Sutton paced before her while 3 of his men lounged nearby, their guns at the ready. Of the 5th man Mrs. Holbrook had mentioned, there was no sign. "Your boyfriend's taking his sweet time," Sutton growled, checking his pocket watch. "Maybe he doesn't care about you as much as I thought." "Or maybe he's smarter than you're giving him credit for," Rebecca retorted, earning herself a dark look from Sutton. "Smart won't save him when he shows up. Or you, for that matter." Jackson needed to act quickly. Taking careful aim, he fired 2 shots in rapid succession, taking out the lanterns that illuminated the chamber and plunging the mine into darkness. Confusion erupted as Sutton and his men shouted and fired blindly toward where the shots had come from. Using the chaos to his advantage, Jackson circled around, staying low and keeping to the shadows. He reached Rebecca's side and pressed a knife into her bound hands. "Cut yourself free," he whispered in her ear. "Then stay down and head for the main entrance when I give the signal." She nodded, her face pale but determined in the faint moonlight that filtered through cracks in the mine's ceiling. Jackson moved away again, firing another shot to draw Sutton's attention in the opposite direction from where Rebecca was working to free herself. "Pierce," Sutton shouted. "Show yourself, you coward." "I'm right here, Sutton," Jackson called back, his voice echoing in the mine and making it difficult to pinpoint his location. "Let the woman go. This is between you and me." "Too late for that," Sutton snarled. "She's seen our faces, can't leave witnesses." One of Sutton's men moved too close to Jackson's position, and with a swift movement, Jackson brought the butt of his gun down on the man's head, dropping him silently to the ground. 3 left, including Sutton. "Your boys are deserting you, Wade," Jackson called out, adding to the confusion. "Harris just took off running." "Liar." But Sutton's voice held a note of uncertainty now. "Boys, sound off," only one voice responded, followed by a curse from Sutton. The odds were improving, but Jackson knew the situation was still dangerous. Glancing toward Rebecca, he saw that she had freed herself and was crouched behind the crate, waiting for his signal. Jackson fired again, this time striking a support beam near where Sutton and his remaining man were positioned. The ancient wood splintered, sending a shower of dust and debris down on them. As they stumbled back, coughing, Jackson whistled sharply the signal for Rebecca to move. She darted forward, staying low and moving swiftly toward the main entrance. But Sutton, recovering more quickly than expected, spotted her movement in the gloom. "There she goes," he shouted, raising his gun. Jackson didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, tackling Sutton just as the man fired. The shot went wide, but the struggle was far from over. They grappled in the darkness, each fighting for control of Sutton's weapon. "Run, Rebecca," Jackson shouted, his voice strained as he fought to keep Sutton's gun pointed away from both of them. From the corner of his eye, he saw her hesitate at the entrance, clearly torn between fleeing to safety and concern for him. "Go," he commanded again, and this time she obeyed, disappearing into the night with Rebecca safe. Jackson focused entirely on the fight at hand. Sutton was strong, but desperation gave Jackson an edge. He slammed Sutton's gun hand against the ground repeatedly until the weapon fell from his grasp, then delivered a solid punch to the rustler's jaw. Sutton reeled back but recovered quickly, pulling a knife from his boot and slashing wildly. The blade caught Jackson's arm, opening a gash that immediately began to bleed. Pain lanced through him, but he managed to grab Sutton's wrist on the next swing, twisting until the knife clattered to the ground. The fight continued, brutal and exhausting, until finally Jackson gained the upper hand. With a last surge of strength, he knocked Sutton unconscious with a powerful right hook, then collapsed beside him, breathing heavily. The silence that followed was broken only by his labored breathing and the distant sound of approaching horses. Reinforcements from the double cross, he hoped, or perhaps the sheriff finally making an appearance. Forcing himself to his feet, Jackson secured Sutton with the man's own belt, then checked on the other rustlers. One was still unconscious, the other was gone, fled, or hiding elsewhere in the mine. Stumbling to the entrance, Jackson was met by a sight that made his heart swell. Rebecca, returning with Sheriff Dawson and several double-cross cowboys, including Sam Cross himself. "Jackson," Rebecca cried, dismounting and rushing to his side. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he assured her, though the wound on his arm was bleeding freely. "Sutton and one of his men are secured inside. A third got away." "We'll find him," Sheriff Dawson promised, gesturing for 2 of his deputies to enter the mine. "Miss James told us what happened." "You did good work here, Pierce." Sam approached, clapping a hand on Jackson's unwounded shoulder. "Damned fine work, but let's get you patched up before you fall over." As they made their way back to town, Rebecca rode beside Jackson, her face etched with concern. "I was so frightened," she admitted quietly. "Not for myself, but for you when I heard the fighting." "I told you to run," Jackson said, his voice gentler than he intended. "I did, but I came back with help. There's a difference between running away and running toward something." Their eyes met in the moonlight, and Jackson felt something shift inside him, like a frozen river beginning to thaw. Back in town, the doctor attended to Jackson's wound, which required several stitches but was not serious. Rebecca stayed by his side throughout, refusing to leave even when Mrs. Holbrook suggested she get some rest after her ordeal. "You should listen to her," Jackson told Rebecca as the doctor finished bandaging his arm. "It's been a long night." "I'm not tired," she insisted, though the shadows under her eyes suggested otherwise. "And I don't want to be alone right now. Jackson understood. After what she'd been through, the quiet darkness of her room might seem more threatening than comforting. Then stay, he said simply. They sat together in the doctor's front room, drinking coffee and talking quietly as the night gave way to dawn. Jackson found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone about his childhood in Missouri, his time in the war, the years of drifting afterward. Rebecca listened, occasionally sharing her own memories of growing up in Kansas before Boston, her struggles to fit in among the proper New England society. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating Rebecca's face, Jackson realized something that both terrified and exhilarated him. He was falling in love with her. The realization must have shown on his face because Rebecca tilted her head questioningly. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said quickly, looking away. "Just tired, I guess." But the moment lingered between them, unspoken yet palpable. In the days that followed, Jackson threw himself into his work at the Double Cross, trying to sort through his feelings. Rebecca, true to her word, took the teaching position, setting up a small school in an unused bunkhouse for the children of the ranch hands and nearby homesteaders. They saw each other often, their paths crossing naturally in the course of their days. Each encounter left Jackson more certain of his feelings and more afraid of them. He'd spent years building walls around his heart, convincing himself he didn't need anyone, that attachments only led to pain. Now those walls were crumbling, and he didn't know whether to shore them up or let them fall. 2 weeks after the incident at the mine, Jackson found himself heading toward the makeshift schoolhouse after the day's lessons had ended. He'd been avoiding Rebecca for the past few days, making excuses when she suggested rides or conversations. But today, something compelled him to seek her out. He found her at her desk, her head bent over some papers, a stray lock of hair falling across her cheek. She looked up as he entered, surprise and something like hope flickering across her face. "Jackson, I was beginning to think you were avoiding me." "I was," he admitted, removing his hat and turning it nervously in his hands. "I'm not good at this. She echoed, standing and moving around her desk to face him, feelings, talking about them. He took a deep breath. "Rebecca, I care for you more than I thought possible, but I'm not sure I know how to be the kind of man you deserve." Her eyes softened. "And what kind of man do you think I deserve?" "Someone steady, reliable, someone who knows how to love without fear." Rebecca stepped closer, her hand reaching up to touch his face. "What I deserve is a man who is honest, brave, and true to himself. A man who would ride into danger to save me without hesitation. A man who, despite claiming he doesn't know how to love, shows it in every action." Jackson closed his eyes, leaning slightly into her touch. "I've been alone a long time. I'm afraid I'll disappoint you." "We're all afraid, Jackson. Love is frightening, but it's also the most powerful force in this world." Her voice grew softer. "I've fallen in love with you, and if you'll let me, I'd like the chance to show you that love doesn't have to be something you fear." The walls around Jackson's heart finally crumbled completely. He drew her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. "I love you too," he whispered against her hair, the words feeling both foreign and perfectly right on his lips. When they kissed, it felt like coming home after a long journey, warm, familiar, right? The summer passed in a blur of happiness as Jackson and Rebecca's relationship deepened. They spent evenings on the porch of her small teacher's cabin, talking about everything and nothing. They rode together on days when neither had responsibilities, exploring the wild beauty of the Arizona territory. And gradually, Jackson opened himself fully to the love he'd denied himself for so long. On a crisp autumn evening, as they sat beneath the old oak tree where he'd first told her the truth about her father, Jackson asked Rebecca to marry him. Her joyful acceptance was all the confirmation he needed that he'd made the right choice in opening his heart. They were married in the spring of 1879, in a small ceremony attended by the Double Cross hands and the townspeople of Nogales who had come to know and respect them both. Sam Cross gave the bride away, and even Sheriff Dawson dressed in his Sunday best for the occasion. That summer, they made the journey to Eagle Canyon, where Jackson had buried Ethan Blackwell years before. Rebecca placed her mother's last letter among the stones of the grave marker, finding closure in the act. "Do you think they're together now?" she asked Jackson as they prepared to leave the canyon. "My mother and father, I like to think so," he replied, taking her hand. "That whatever kept them apart in this life has been resolved in the next." Rebecca smiled, a bittersweet expression that held both grief and acceptance. "Thank you for bringing me here, for giving me the truth, even when it wasn't easy. No more secrets between us," Jackson promised. "Not ever." As they rode away from Eagle Canyon, Jackson felt the last of his old burdens lifting. The past would always be part of him, but it no longer defined him. What defined him now was the love he shared with Rebecca, the future they were building together. 3 years later, in the summer of 1882, Jackson stood on the porch of their small ranch house built on land Sam Cross had sold them as a wedding present, watching Rebecca in the garden, their 1-year-old son, Samuel, toddling beside her on unsteady legs. The sight filled Jackson's chest with a warmth he once thought impossible. "Papa," Samuel called, spotting him and breaking into a wobbly run toward the porch. Jackson scooped up his son, lifting him high into the air as the boy squealed with delight. Rebecca approached, her smile as bright as the Arizona sun, her hand resting protectively on the slight swell of her stomach where their second child was growing. "He's been asking for you all morning," she said, leaning in to kiss Jackson's cheek. "Apparently, I'm no substitute for Papa." "No one's a substitute for Mama," Jackson replied, pulling her close with his free arm. "Not even Papa." As they stood together, a family forged from love and truth and second chances, Jackson remembered the man he'd once been, a solitary cowboy who claimed he'd never cry, who'd built his life around avoiding attachments and emotions. That man seemed like a stranger now, a shadow dispersed by the light of the love he'd found. That night, after Samuel was asleep and the house was quiet, Jackson and Rebecca sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. Her head rested on his shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. "Are you happy, Jackson?" she asked, her voice soft in the darkness. He considered the question, thinking of the journey that had brought him here, the losses and gains, the pain and joy, the walls built and demolished. "More than I ever thought possible," he answered honestly. "You taught me that it's okay to feel, to care, to love. You saved me, Rebecca." "We saved each other," she corrected gently. As they sat in comfortable silence, Jackson reflected on how close he had come to missing this life, this love. If Rebecca hadn't been determined to find her father, if she hadn't challenged him, if she had simply walked away that day in the livery stable. The thought sent a chill through him, and he held her closer, grateful beyond words that their paths had crossed, that she had been stubborn enough to stay, and that he had been brave enough, finally, to love. Under the endless stars of the Arizona night, Jackson Pierce, once a cowboy who said he'd never cry, found himself blinking back tears of gratitude and joy, unashamed of the emotion that now defined his life.